Hey guys, how you doing? Things may look a little different today. I have to try a different configuration. I've got two webcams set up, but I haven't been too happy with the audio quality, and it's essentially very noisy. I noticed when I'm filming my videos. I had to do a little switcheroo. I have two cams, one that I'm using for audio, one that I'm using for video, and the one that actually does the video better, I'm now using for audio, but it's also the one that making a lot of those clicking sounds and stuff like that when I'm filming. So, in an effort to kind of get rid of that, to maximize the audio quality a little better, I have to use the older webcam for the visual, so things aren't going to be as clear, which is a real advantage, I think, to my viewers. Except for when I show album covers, they might not come across as clear, so I apologize for that in advance. I've been putting this one off for a while because I knew it was going to run long, and that is kind of my appreciation of Anthony Phillips, the British musician. A lot of history, that's why. Oddly enough, Anthony Phillips was a founding member of Genesis, but he only played on their first two albums, from Genesis to Revelation and Trespass, which were very, very early albums. They weren't the pop band then, and Phil Collins wasn't in the band at that point. Peter Gabriel was, however, and left after their second album, which would have been around 1970. However, he was really initially their most sophisticated musician in the band, really before Tony Banks kind of picked that up when Anthony Phillips left. And even though he left after the second album, they actually continued with a lot of ideas that he had developed in the context of the group. And the band's future albums still played in the 70s, all the way through the 70s, on a sound, especially with using a couple 12-string guitars in combination, that Anthony Phillips came up with guitarist Mike Rutherford, or bassist Mike Rutherford, rhythm guitarist Mike Rutherford as well. And they continued that after Anthony left. Tony Banks even picking up and playing that second guitar part, even though he wasn't the lead guitarist, more so than Steve Hackett, which was Anthony Phillips' replacement. And I can see why they continued with that sound. It certainly served them well on their early albums, and really continued, really till all the way till 1977, pretty much. And what happened? Well, Anthony Phillips ended up leaving the band and decided to attend music school and get a formal training, and became a teacher for a while. He left in 70, and his first solo album came out in 77. Very much, well, I was going to say very much, it depends on how much you know about Genesis. If you go back to to an album like Trespass, it was very pastoral, some beautiful movements in there, very acoustic oriented. If you're real familiar with that, you may not have been quite as surprised when Anthony Phillips started recording instrumental albums. But it took him until 77, I think it was, before his first album was released as a solo artist. And initially, in the beginning days, he flipped back and forth a little bit, and with a couple different styles, which he expanded on. And I'm actually going to show you the albums not to buy by him first. His first album, we actually had two releases kind of simultaneously in 77 after not having recorded at all for 7 years. One was an instrumental album, which I will get to. The other was kind of a vocal album. And probably because of his association, obviously, with Genesis, who by that time, by the time this came out in 77, pretty big cult band. Anthony Phillips did do a few albums of kind of vocal, I don't know if you'd quite call them prog rock, maybe prog rock a little more song oriented. He didn't go off in 20-minute tangents, but there was those signs of prog rock with the electric keyboards and stuff like that. and an early vocal album. The first three albums I'm going to show you are spread out over a few years, but they're all fairly early albums, and they're not the things I would ever recommend anybody get. Wise After the Event, which is a vocal album. Anthony is not a great singer, um, and that hurts a little bit, but it's really just that if he wasn't so good doing other things, maybe I would listen to these more closely and try to get something good out of them. But honestly, the lyrics are a little, they're a little depressing, actually, to tell you the truth in a lot of cases, certainly in the case of this album. And he's not a bad lyricist, but they're actually kind of sad, depressing lyrics. He's got Michael Giles on here, if you know the early incarnation of King Crimson. I'm trying to think of Mel Collins, who was actually in a later version of King Crimson. Rupert Hine on here. Quite a few musicians helping him out. Now Anthony essentially was the lead guitarist at Genesis, and remained lead guitarist. But by the time he started recording solo albums, he was easily as adept on keyboards, including piano, as he is guitars. And fantastic talent. It's really hard to say what he's better at. Here's another one that came a little bit later, 79 Sides. This is another kind of trying to cross over into a vocal thing, kind of aimed toward maybe the Genesis fans, but there's no real big instrumental suites in these. They're mostly vocal songs. They kind of have the overall vibe of prog rock with heavy on electric keyboards and electric guitars and stuff like that. Again, Michael Giles playing on here. Ray Cooper, who is a British percussionist that plays with everybody, Eric Clapton, everybody. Maurice Pert, who played with a lot of different people, but a lot of people know him from Brand X, maybe. Just a lot of people helping him out. Mel Collins plays on here a little bit too. Again, a couple decent vocal songs on here, but I can't recommend it, especially in light of the other things that he's done. And in '83, he took one kind of, I'll say it's the last stab. I mean, he's still recording, so I don't think he'll try this again. He took a last stab at kind of and in this way, a real pop rock band. It was called Invisible Men, but it was Anthony Phillips and one other guy, and the one other guy really contributes very little. It's essentially an Anthony Phillips solo album, but this is pure pop. And I hate to say it, it works better probably than the first two albums, because there's no pretense of doing anything but short poppy songs, vocally oriented. I wouldn't say it's a better album, but it's more successful in its goal, simply because I think they had extremely limited scope of what they were trying to do, and kind of achieved it. But it's it's what can I say? All those albums I wouldn't recommend, because if somebody bought them, they would probably say, "Oh, I don't like Anthony Phillips music," unless you strictly want vocal rock or vocal pop or something like that. But in light of now, at the same time as those albums came out, Anthony was releasing other stuff. And it's this other stuff that's really the groundbreaking stuff. This could definitely be called New Age, but the funny thing is there really was no New Age back in '77, '78. Once New Age started happening, some existing artists got thrown in there that had already been around. People like Tangerine Dream and Klaus Schultz on the electronic side. But what Anthony Phillips did essentially is almost kind of create the acoustic side of New Age music, without trying to, and without the bad memories or the bad associations that New Age music brings up. It wasn't him trying to mellow you out while you sit in the hot tub music. It was basically acoustic oriented, and I'll tell you, whenever I think of his music, I really don't think of that pop stuff. What I think of is pastoral English British countryside, and he indeed lives in England, and I believe he lives in the countryside. And this is the perfect music for that. I'm surprised he isn't used as a soundtrack composer for British films a lot more than he is. He's done TV, a lot of TV and film music, but I'm talking major motion pictures. He's that good. He should be like those Merchant Ivory films or something like that. Should be hiring him as a composer. I could easily see him as being an equal to like a Mark Isham in terms of doing film soundtracks. Um, the first album that he really came out with that was really this is what 77, so this would have been along with Wise After the Event, the first vocal album I showed. These came out pretty much simultaneously, I think. The Geese and the Ghost. This is very good. This is largely instrumental, with Anthony Phillips playing acoustic guitars, classical guitars, bass, dulcimer, bouzouki. He plays some synth mellotron, which I love, but they're very subdued in this. Harmonium, piano, organ. He does, on occasion on these albums, his early, largely instrumental albums, he has a tendency of doing maybe one, very rarely two vocal songs on the album. But they're short. You're talking a 3 or 4 minute song in a 50-minute album. And like I said, he's not a great singer, but when he does these limited vocal songs on his albums, they're almost always ballads, and his voice can carry them, or he finds a good key to play them in that are complementary to his voice. The music is kind of like the album cover. And again, the visual's not as good, so I don't know how clear that's going to come out. He also has, interestingly, he always has a lot of musicians helping him out on this, though there's no doubt most of the music is coming from him. Oddly enough, this album actually has 2 vocal tracks on there, both ballads, both fairly slow. Oddly enough, 1977, who's singing the vocals on this album? Anthony Phillips usually does one vocal himself, and a lot of times that's the only vocal song on the album. And on occasion, on these early ones, when he has a second vocal song or so, he usually gets a guest. And in this case, it's no other than Phil Collins, who he didn't even play with in Genesis. I believe he was introduced to Phil Collins through Mike Rutherford, who was a founding member of Genesis that Anthony played with, obviously, in Genesis, and kept in touch with and collaborated with over the years. And maybe Anthony was looking for a vocalist, and Mike introduced him to Phil Collins. Oddly enough, John Hackett, who is the brother of Steve Hackett. Steve Hackett's the guitarist who replaced Anthony in Genesis. John Hackett also plays flute on this. So again, I don't know where the introductions came from. Anthony had not met Steve Hackett prior to his leaving. Steve Hackett didn't join until sometime after Anthony was long gone. But yet his brother John Hackett is on here playing flute. Again, probably an introduction through Mike Rutherford. And other guys, Jack Lancaster, who you may know from British albums. Anybody on here? There's a lot of people on here, but not necessarily a lot of people that you would know, unless you're into a really obscure British artist. This is pretty good. It's better than pretty good. It's really the establishing of his acoustic-oriented sound. There's actually three. They're short, but there's 3 vocal songs on here, which are a lot more than you'll typically get on his records later on. And maybe that's a bit too much for me. And but I really shouldn't let it overpower the other 75 or more percent of the album that's instrumental, that's beautiful and brilliant. Continuing on, what else do I have here? I have a combination of vinyl. I'll show you the vinyl when I have it. And a lot of these vinyls, some of these vinyls I don't actually have on CD. And I have a bunch of CDs that I don't have on vinyl. And you have to forgive me while I go through these to try to figure out an order to show these. Anthony actually started this series almost simultaneously with starting to record, because I believe the the first in the series came out in 77 or 78. And the first album I ever remember seeing in the store, which was not one that I bought, I just remember it coming out, was something called Private Parts and Pieces. And it originally came out, I want to say around 77. I'm looking at the CD now. I don't see a date on here. But I'm sure it was 77 or 78 because I remember seeing the vinyl in a store. Called Private Parts and Pieces. And kind of, this is, where I wish I had the vinyl to show you, but I don't. This is one in a series of a couple different series that Anthony has. Initially, his idea for these were pieces that he wrote and recorded over the years, usually fairly short in length. There's no real epics here. Bite my tongue because there's an 11-minute track on here. But these were generally things that he recorded and wrote, not necessarily with an eye toward having it included on an album, or didn't have an overall concept for an album. So there were pieces, and in this case, in the case of Volume 1, he didn't even have a recording contract. So there's a bunch of pieces that he wrote. These are almost all exclusively, I want to say, instrumental. I don't believe any of the Private Parts and Pieces series has any vocal songs on here. And if it does, it would be just one track on a couple of the early ones. But this is really, Private Parts and Pieces, I remember seeing on display in a store like it was a big deal, interestingly enough. And I don't know if that may have been because by the time it came out in 77 or 78, Genesis was very big as a cult band, not the pop band they later became, but they were very big as a cult band. And they had very, very few solo releases. At that time, I think Peter Gabriel would have been the only one that had any solo albums out. So possibly because of the Genesis connection, he got an extra boost from that connection. And because I remember seeing this album on display as a new release, and I was surprised because I hadn't heard of him or hadn't known who he was. That was Private Parts and Pieces number uno. He continues with the series to this day. I didn't realize I don't have this on CD. But 1980, he came out with Private Parts and Pieces 2. And again, it's a collection of pieces that probably weren't meant for a specific album, but by the time number 2 came out, and I think number 1 was fairly successful. Actually, it was more successful than his vocal albums. I began to get the feeling listening to these, they're very cohesive when played together as a whole. And I tend to think that maybe by the time he did Private Parts and Pieces number 2, that he was thinking of an album concept that wanted to kind of continue the series of albums, because there's really nothing in here that sounds like the first album where one piece might have been recorded a year after another piece. But now Anthony had a recording contract and he was pumping out albums, and I believe all of this music was pretty much recorded at the same time. See, there's a recording date for the album of being most of it in November and December of 77, and some of it June 76. So there may be a couple things, but most of it appears to be one session, and one of the longer pieces was recorded the prior year, but not really a thrown together album like I would think of a thrown together album as one piece from 5 years prior to another piece and like that. So I think by the time he went in 77, late 77, to record the majority of this album, that Anthony already had the idea in mind for Private Parts and Pieces too, and kind of kept the name more than the concept, because the concept of the first one was just these individual things that were strewn about that he had recorded, and that was, again, at a time that he didn't have a contract, and then just kind of put them together. This plays very much, from what I remember, and I haven't played it for years, as a very cohesive whole. And actually, all of the Private Parts and Pieces albums after this do. They're not really these things of something from years ago and something from a month ago kind of thrown on the album. Very pretty. Again, pastoral. I'm looking to see if there may be a vocal tune on this one. Um, there may be a single vocal tune, but I'm not seeing it listed as such. And in general, they were pretty much dropped. But nice album, nice, pretty pastoral album. Um, I could recommend it. I could recommend a lot of these. By the time he came to Private Parts and Pieces number 3, which was 2 years later, in '82, I think that Anthony was just set on continuing the series rather than the concept of pieces strewn all over the place. Because this album is a collection of guitar duets and ensembles, and the ensemble being mostly multiple guitars with a second guitarist, Enrique Berrio Garcia. So, considering that Enrico Berrio Garcia plays on the whole album, I don't think there's even a single track without him. Um, it's very clear that this was a concept for the album to record these two guitarists playing together, and it's not so much an odds and sods collection of tracks. So there's classical mostly it's acoustic and nylon string guitars. There's very little electric guitar on here, and there's a little bit of bass guitar played by Anthony Garcia, but it's mostly 12 and 6 string guitars. And this was recorded in June '81. So it's not really that whole concept of little pieces on the shelf that I'm going to put together on an album. Yet he did call it Private Parts and Pieces. Antiques is the actual title of the album, and in the corner it says Private Parts and Pieces 3. So I think it was Anthony wanting to continue the concept. And again, this is a more limited sound because it's just the guitars. There's no keyboards, there's no synthesizers. So you have to be in the mood to sit down and listen to this. It's very warm. There's very little electric guitar in here. So it's more for people that really want to hear the interplay of a couple guitarists and even multiple overdubs of guitars, but mostly acoustic and nylon string guitars. And it's a very good album, but it doesn't kind of present the whole palette of Anthony's works. So I wouldn't say go with it as a first buy if you were kind of trying to sample his work. Now in '86, because a few years later again, Anthony continued. I'm sorry because I'm skipping around. That's the 6th part. I only showed the 3rd part. See, some of these I have on vinyl, some I have on CD, and there's 3 on CD, which I do have on CD. Okay, here's 4. Private Parts and Pieces 4, which came out I don't know when. This has to be early '80s. The thing screwing me up here is I have a reissue. So the date's not helping me much. But this has to be after the last album. So it has to be sometime early '80s. Private Parts and Pieces 4 is called A Catch at the Tables. And again, this is an album that is not the odds and sods kind of let's throw something together. This was recorded pretty much in one shot, meant as a concept for an album. I do see one track was recorded in 1980, and actually, let me bite my tongue again, because this one, as opposed to the last one, which was recorded in the course of I think a couple months, this one actually does look like it returns back to the idea of the series, the original album, because I'm seeing pieces recorded in '79, '81, 1980, 81, 80, 81. So pretty much up to '82. Oh, I'm seeing '85 too. I'm seeing '85. But that's later. Yeah, this is a. It's hard to say because when this got reissued later, they did throw on an extra track which comes from a later period. But it looks like this is going back to the original concept of the album of having pieces on the shelf kind of from 79, 80, 81, 80. I see 82. Yeah, it looks like the bonus tracks were recorded a little bit later, so I don't want to confuse matters. But that's another one that there's not much information in the book, and it appears that in this case, on this album, that Anthony may be the only musician. No, I see a couple guest musicians here and there, but there's not very much. A lot of Anthony again on 12-string guitars, and he's playing a bit of synthesizer on here. He plays bass. Polymoog improvisation from 1979. I haven't played this for years, and I want to hear it again. 12-string guitar, 12-string guitar. So a lot of acoustic guitar-oriented things, but he does have some keyboards on here. I actually only saw one guest musician. So it appears that the number 4 in the series, The Catch at the Tables, is largely again, and I was wrong, going back to that concept of pieces off the shelf, which he hadn't really done except for the first album. Volume 2 and 3 were pretty much sessions that were created, I believe, for that particular album. And here he's gone back and gotten some pieces off the shelves, and I remember this being a very good album. And this is one I'm gonna definitely give a play to as soon as I'm done here. I don't know if I have number 5. Did I miss number 5 in the series? I'll have to hurt myself. I think I missed number 5 in the series, because the next one I have is number 6. I don't even know what number 5 is. Number 6 from 1986. So the other one had to be originally came out, must have been 85. Volume 6 in Private Parts and Pieces is actually called Ivory Moon, and you have to actually turn it over and read it on the back before it even references Private Parts and Pieces. And this again is because it's really not like the first and I guess the fourth volumes were the odds and sods stuff of grabbing things. This was all recorded in August 1985, and this is I guess the theme being that even though these were recorded in 85, the pieces themselves were written between 1971 and 1985, but the recordings of the older pieces is all new. It's all from August 1985, and that's common that musicians will let a piece sit up on the shelf for a number of years before they record it. Maybe it's not finished, or maybe they record more than one version of the works, but essentially it was all recorded in August 1985. This is a piano-only album, though, and as pretty as it is, kind of like the Volume 3 that was just pretty much guitars only, very pretty, but not a place that I would start because it doesn't have that full palette. It's only an acoustic piano album, and that's all that's on there. And so that was number 6. Now we get to number 7, which was from 1987. So he was pretty much, even though he did other things in between, almost an album a year in the Private Parts and Pieces series, and it still continues today. I don't think he stopped doing it really. He doesn't record albums under that title as much, but he's constantly recording. The next one, which was on the Odeon label, actually this one is not an important, did come out, you're not going to be able to see that, did come out on the Odeon label, short-lived label, has been reissued since. 1987 is Private Parts and Pieces 7, Soft Waves, Slow Stars. This is a particular favorite of mine, and this would be the one, well, amongst the top 3 that I would tell people to get, but specifically I would tell Carm to get if he didn't have it, because there's a lot more synthesizer on there. This is one of his most synthesizer-oriented albums, though, and I believe it's almost totally solo. and there's some guitar pieces in here, acoustic guitar still, but not as much as on the other albums. It's very much a our Polymoog, Casio, Roland, Jupiter 8th. And when I hear some of those keyboard names, I think of cheesy keyboard sounds, but these are very good keyboard sounds that he uses. Nylon string guitars, 12-string guitars. There's I don't know. There's it listed as being a drum machine on here, but if it's there, it's very subtle or in a very short piece because I don't remember any. Um, yeah, Tibetan bells and chimes, zither. So there's a lot of interesting instruments on here. That album is the most keyboard oriented of the series, and electric keyboards, electronic keyboards, and really pretty stuff. I remember the NPR. There's a nightly show called New Sounds that plays on an NPR station out of New York, but it's syndicated all over the country. And I remember them playing this. But I would have gotten it anyway. I bought that as a new release, and it's come out. It's been reissued since, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's been reissued with bonus tracks. And again, not an album that was really pieced together like the first and fourth ones were. They're very much a concept recorded for that album. So I don't know why he continued to call these things private parts and pieces when all these albums actually have alternate titles as well. But here's another one. Here's the eighth in the series, titled New England. And what the title refers to, I'm not 100% sure exactly. This one has a 1992 date on there, which would mean I don't know if this is a reissue, which I don't think it is. Or yeah, actually there's a pretty long gap here because the last one was what 87. This one came out in 92 and was recorded in 91 various times in March. It was written in March 91 for the most part, recorded December 91, January, February 92, and mixed in 92 and released in 92. Pretty album. There are guest musicians on here, largely again an acoustic palette thing going on, guitars, mandolin, charanga, some keyboards, not a whole lot. Keyboards may be here referring to piano. I don't remember there being a lot of synthesizer on here. He's got Martin Robertson playing soprano saxophone and African drums. He doesn't use a lot of saxophone on his albums, but when it's there, it's really beautiful. Simon Morris on cello. He's got a percussionist that plays rainstick, cymbals, shakers, tabla. Actually, two different percussionists, and mostly hand drums, not drum kit drums. That's a real pretty album too, from what I remember. I've got so many by him that they tend to bleed together a little bit for me, and I believe that's it for the Private Parts and Pieces series. I guess it continued. These aren't all of them, and that's number 8. He started for some reason I don't quite understand. I guess he likes having things falling under the blanket of a series, because while he was still putting out the Private Parts and Pieces series, he created another one called Missing Links, and as volume I have 4 volumes, and I think they're I'm not sure if a 5th one came out yet, but this one did start quite a bit later. I want to say this didn't start till the 90s coming out, but I could be wrong. Yeah, 1991 is the copyright date on here. Now, initially, and actually for the first 3 of the series, this is actually a collection of television and library music. So it goes back to the Private Parts and Pieces thing, where those were odds and sods pieces that had been recorded, not with a specific album in mind. At least that was the original concept. That changed pretty quickly. This one started as a collection of television and library music. So it was little instrumental things that were recorded for television programs. It seems like a lot of nature programs like to use this music, which makes sense when you hear it. And Anthony basically took the best of them. So there's a lot of shorter tracks on here, 3 minutes in length, 2 minutes in length, a lot of those. There's a couple 5 and 6 minutes on here, but that's it. And he does do one suite that's almost 13 minutes long. Doesn't list where these would have been seen as far as in general. A lot of these he does list the numbers of the pieces, like it was on a TV documentary. One was actually from an Oil of Olay TV commercial. This is in England, mind you. National Panasonic Audiovisual New Zealand Lamb TV commercial. But it doesn't actually list more details than that. So, like the one that's about a TV documentary about wildlife in Hong Kong, for instance, I don't know what the title of that is because it doesn't list the title of the documentary that it was from. But these are good. If it wasn't for the shortness of the pieces, you wouldn't really guess. It's not secondary ignorable music. Again, it's a lot of acoustic-oriented instrumentation with a bit of synthesizer added. Very, very pretty. If anything, there's only 4 discs that I have so far in this series. I like them because just about all of the ones from the series tend to have all of Anthony's strengths, with the exception of not having incredibly long tracks, in that they have his acoustic guitar work, classical guitar work, and usually synthesizers. And he's got just this beautiful palette. I mean, when you listen to his music, if you don't see the countryside and the forest and things like that, I'd be very surprised. Going to Missing Links, Volume 2. When did it come out? I don't know, because it's getting darker in this room as I speak. 2002. 2002, wow. Though again, this could be a reissue. I'm trying to find out when this is from. Again, this is the Volume 2. A lot the same in the first. This is a good. If you buy one of these discs, you will get an idea of what the music is like in the other 3 or 4 that are in the batch. Again, these are pieces spread out over the years, used for television and commercials. It also says archive material, and the funny thing with that is, well, that's kind of what the Private Parts and Pieces series is. It's kind of archive material. So it's almost like they're starting to blend a little bit, these 2 series that he has going on. But I'm seeing pieces from 88, 90, 91, 93. Going back to 87. Yeah, so these are a lot of pieces. I think the archive material may be a couple of bonus tracks. I think they're bonus tracks. No, I'm not sure. Maybe they were on the original issue of the album. He's actually got a couple things all the way at the end that might be what he's referring to as archive material. He's actually got some things that he recorded in 72 and 73. Which is long before he had a recording contract. So that might be the archive material that he's referring to here, and the rest of the stuff, which those 2 are kind of included as a bonus tracks. The rest of the stuff is pretty much the television and library, film music, documentary music, that kind of thing. Real pretty nice album. You can't go wrong with any of these Missing Links sections. And 2 of my favorite albums of his are the next 2. Missing Links, Volume 3. This one is called Time and Tide, so he's starting to get subtitles for these like he did with the Private Parts and Pieces series. And I know, the lousiness of the visual camera, the fact that I can't hold my hand still, doesn't help. This one is actually, even though it says it's television and library music, from 1992 to 97, there's a co-credit on here with Hoji Hirata. So I don't know if this is a collaborative. It is a collaborative effort, but I think this is a collaborator that is somebody that maybe Anthony started working with somewhere around 92 and liked what he brought to his music and continued to work with him. Because I believe that Hirota plays on most, if not all, of the tracks on the album. And so even though they span quite a lot of years, or a handful of years anyway. And so is Anthony Phillips on keyboards, guitars again. Hirota is a percussionist who also plays flutes, recorder, and shakuhachi, the Japanese flute. And there's also an additional musician, Q Yo, who plays Chinese flutes on two different tracks. So that might be a little hard to pick up that musician's contribution to the music because the Hirota is playing also various types of flutes. It's a real boy. I can recommend this one. I believe it's got some synthesizers on it, but a lot of acoustic guitars. That light percussion work that Hirota brings in here, along with the ethnic flutes, real pretty stuff. Kind of a shame that it was just hey, it's good to use for various library and documentary music, but really deserves to be heard on its own. Now the next album, and I bought this new. This it took a while for another one in the series to come out. Volume 4, called Pathways and Promenades. It's a fairly recent release, and again, it's as pastoral and beautiful as the picture. Loved it right off the bat. This one on the cover, even though it's called itself Missing Links Volume 4, it's not. It's more of a well. There's a lot of pieces on here that are actually from, and it's nice that they got compiled. That they did this. I wish more artists would do this. There was a lot of individual tracks of Anthony Phillips, apparently, and I was unaware of them, that got spread out on various artist compilations. So he would contribute one track to an album, and that would be the only track, by Anthony Phillips in that album. But almost entirely they would be tracks that weren't taken from any of his solo albums, and they were tracks that were only available on those various artist compilations. And what he did here is, and I had forgotten this, compiled a whole bunch of those tracks from these compilations that are pretty much out of print. And I wish more artists did this because, there's been times I know myself when I've bought an album because of one track by an artist that was something that you couldn't get on any of his own albums, and the rest of the album was a waste. So this here was on some very obscure compilations, and there was actually one of them is a compilation of Anthony Phillips' best of that was released apparently only in Spain, and Anthony had recorded a new track for that, even though he knew the compilation would only be released in Spain. So he included that track here. And I just remembered this, and it's funny because listening to it, and this is music that pretty much ranges from the late '80s to the early '90s, I want to say. But I was seeing one piece here from all the way from 2008, and I know that this album only came out fairly recently, the last few years, because I bought this actually. Was so excited to see another one. I pre-ordered it, and again, another nice album. It's getting hard to read as it gets darker in here. About in terms of how many guests are on here, I can't see because I'm not seeing a lot of names of additional musicians. But there's so many pieces on here that I'd be surprised if there wasn't a couple guest musicians here and there. Largely, though, it's Anthony Phillips on his own, doing his thing. And just to show, it's a single disc. There's 23 tracks on here, so it'll show you that there's not a whole lot of incredibly long tracks, but it's beautiful, and I still highly recommend this, especially Volume 3 and 4 of the Missing Links, as they're called, series. And a lot of times he very carefully sequences these pieces, even though you get the situation where there's years between the pieces. You'll jump from a piece from 1987 to a piece from 5 years later or so. He's very careful to sequence the pieces and select pieces that are also compatible. So if you were to, like I said, there's 23 selections on that disc, and when you're playing them, it's not always apparent that you've really listened to so many pieces. Yeah, you may be listening to the album and you look up at the counter on the CD player and think that you've heard maybe two or three pieces when you've heard 10 or 11. So they're very carefully sequenced so that they're very compatible. When they go from one section to the other, it seems like it could actually be a composition with multiple sections. And that's one of the things that's nice, especially about that series, the Missing Link series. They're very carefully sequenced, which I really dig. Um, couple other things that aren't parts of series I'm going to show you. Anthony Phillips did a couple albums with a guy named Harry Williamson. One called Gypsy Suite. Harry Williamson essentially is a guitarist. Pretty much the two of them, very guitar oriented. Not so much little percussion, little bit of keyboards played by both of them. So it's hard to tell. You can't really tell in Tarka, which was a soundtrack to I guess it's a nature documentary film, largely. Very, very, very pretty thing that also the two of them did. And again, they both play essentially the same instruments. They both play a lot of guitars. Music's based around a lot of guitars, some electric keyboards, but they both play, and it's hard to tell who's doing what. Those are real pretty albums too. Tarka and Gypsy Suite. These are earlier editions of the albums too, so it's possible that they've come out with more since, with bonus tracks and stuff, and additional things on there. And there's a slightly different. Gypsy Suite actually has a slightly different version, I believe, of the Tarka, of some of the Tarka music. And I don't know. I don't necessarily. I'm not sure if it's a different mix or an entirely different version. But I didn't regret buying either album. And when it comes to these albums, I think, if you don't know where to start, you might want to look at one that's very reasonably priced, a budget one. As long as you stay away from some things like those vocal albums, which are just not real representative of his work. I'm going to go back to show a couple things that you probably should stay away from too. There's something called the Archive Collection. There's a second volume that I don't have, and this is something for hardcore Anthony Phillips fans that have to have everything. They're essentially demos recorded in the early '70s of songs that he later rearranged and recorded professionally. But it's very rough going stuff, and it's really only of interest to hardcore people. And Anthony Phillips Anthology, which normally would be a good place for people to begin with a selection by an artist they don't know. Unfortunately, the anthology is, well, it is a cross selection of a lot of his albums, but unfortunately there's also a big selection of the vocal material, and it doesn't really fit in with the instrumental stuff so much, and there's quite a lot of vocal material on there. So I wouldn't think I would only think it's good if you wanted to see everything that Anthony does, fine. But I don't know if there's enough of the instrumental stuff that would really turn you on and make you appreciate the quality of so many of his instrumental albums. Especially for some reason, there's a big emphasis on this anthology of vocal material, which I was a little surprised at. So again, not a place I would start. A couple things that are oddities for fans more. Actually, a live album. Anthony doesn't perform live. So this one came out and has since been reissued. It's called The Living Room Concert. This was recorded, I want to say, for the Echoes radio program. I know it's a program that plays here in the U.S. and they contacted Anthony Phillips. Is it Echoes that do the Living Room concerts? Because Echoes has a series of discs. I'm pretty sure it's Echoes, called the Living Room Concerts, that are multi-artist compilation albums that feature the musicians actually coming into their recording studio, and or sometimes their home, the musician's home, and recording essentially a live concert without an audience. And Anthony Phillips did one of those. Would have been nice, actually. They also do interviews, and it would have been nice for them to maybe keep the interview on here, but they probably thought it had limited interest. So Anthony Phillips was invited by the radio show, and I believe went to their studios to do essentially a live solo performance for them for the radio show, and then they picked various pieces, I guess, to broadcast. Um, it's pretty much instrumental, I think, and these are all pieces that he's recorded on other albums. But I believe it's largely a single acoustic guitar oriented thing, so it's not going to give you the full palette of his studio albums with the overdubs and everything. So it's more of a thing when you are getting to the point when you have most of his good stuff to kind of pick up. And another album, very good album. This one is something that I'm looking for a date. 1990. Actually, originally came out on Virgin Records. There's no series associated with this. It's not the Private Parts and Pieces series. It's not the Missing Link series. It's simply called Slow Dance. Slow Dance is another good one for the slightly more electronic side. And it's interesting. It's two long pieces. I want to say they're each about, doesn't list it here. I want to say there's only part one and part two. And I want to say they're about 23 to 25 minutes long for each piece. Recorded February 1989. So in the course of his other two series going on, he was doing this one as well. He's got a bunch of musicians on here. Playing clarinet, oboe, flute, piccolo, trumpet, harps, even a drummer. None of the names anybody would really recognize, but you can see that it's very almost classically oriented with that horn section playing, very, very much written out music. But Anthony's contribution to this, besides writing all of the pieces, is largely, from what I remember, electronic keyboards. But he's got that whole acoustic, classical type horn section going on. So it's very pretty. It's two longer pieces, which are fairly rare to hear Anthony Phillips albums laid out like that, and definitely one I would put up there in a list of good ones to get fairly early on. Down to something else. Here's another thing that's basically for collectors like me who is just interested in all aspects of Anthony's career. This might be a little confusing. It's an album simply called music. It's called Ahead of the Field, but it's music for TV and film. Well, I know you're thinking, well, the Missing Link series is music for TV and film, but these are tracks that Anthony intentionally left off the other compilation kind of albums or the Missing Link series because they're very dated sounding. These were all recorded as library music at the request of, I believe, a specific producer who wanted a very kind of new wave synthesizer sound, but instrumental music of stuff in the early 80s. And it sounds very, very dated. The music would never be used today in anything, but that's what this producer was looking for. And it doesn't really fit in with the Missing Link stuff. The Missing Link stuff, and even the Private Parts and Pieces series, Anthony's very careful to select music that ages well. And this is very dated sounding stuff, and actually only came out a few years ago, kind of as more of an interesting thing for hardcore fans. But not to be confused with the Missing Link series, which also has TV and library music, but that's the stuff on those albums really has aged well. And just a couple more. 1984 was a concept album that Anthony Phillips did. I want to say this was done in 81. This is my original vinyl. And this isn't the nods and sods. Yes, it was recorded August 80 to January 81 and was meant to be a kind of futuristic sounding synthesizer album. This is not what I would play for somebody who says, oh, I heard about Anthony Phillips, let me hear some of his music. It sounds like it's done by a completely different artist. It's all synthesizer. There's very little guitar on here. Um, but it's also very heavy on a very dated drum machine sound, and it's a lot of the sections are very up tempo. There's two shorter pieces. There's four selections overall. One piece is 2 minutes 29 seconds. The other one is 4:19, and the other two sections are 15 and a half minutes and 19 minutes. Those are the ones with obviously the meat. But I wouldn't recommend this as a first purchase because it's totally not really relevant to his other music. It doesn't really relate to it very well, and it does have a very it's from 80 81. It has a very dated sound, not only on the synthesizers, which is something that Anthony is very careful to avoid on other albums, but also it's the musical direction is something very different that he set out to do. I can enjoy it on its own, but it doesn't sound like an Anthony Phillips album. And he has done a couple others that I pointed out that were very electronic oriented, that were much better actually and richer in terms of the sound and more representative. Um, and yet I actually have no less than two copies on CD. I actually bought this on the original CD issue, and they came out with a two-disc set a few years later. And the second disc basically has alternate mixes, and there is a couple extra bits and pieces on there that weren't on the original album, but I still wouldn't make that a purchase until after you had all of the great things by him. As much as I love the electronic side of things, it's not real representative. It's very dated sounding, and it really doesn't give you a feel for what Anthony Phillips music is all about. Now, he's done a lot in recent years of very much acoustic oriented albums, and I got this double album set of his recorded in 2004 and 2005. This is on the Blueprint label, so it's a British import. It's called Field Day. Very pretty, two discs, very long. And I'm a little surprised that he did two discs on this because he limited himself only to essentially these are all almost entirely live acoustic or classical guitar pieces. Very short. The first CD has 29 tracks on it. The second CD has 32 tracks on it. So show you how short these pieces are. And it's almost entirely classical guitar. There's 10-string acoustic guitars, 6-string acoustic guitars, 12-string acoustic guitars. Occasionally, and for me most interestingly, he gets into occasionally other instruments. He plays a charango on a few tracks, and he does overdubs on that. So it's there's a bit more colors of sound there than with most of the other tracks that are essentially live guitars. He plays mandolin on a couple tracks. He plays a Greek bouzouki on, I only see one track here. The rest are pretty, two tracks he plays bouzouki on. But again, they're a couple minutes long each in the context of like over 2 hours of music. Most of it is acoustic and classical guitars. Most of it is essentially live. Very pretty stuff. Stuff you'd put on in Daydream too. It's almost impossible sometimes to focus on it because you do start daydreaming. And he does theme albums like that too, that he's gotten into more recently. And albums that he does put the electric keyboards aside. But I knew this was going to be a long one. Very worthwhile, and I hope that if you do jump into his music and you want to discover, try to figure out what album to get, that my video helps, or just send me a message on the video and I'll make a suggestion based on what you might like. But stay away from the vocal albums unless you've got everything else by him. The 1984 album, I'd say stay away from that one too. Not representative, lacking the beauty of his albums, and most of his other stuff, especially the Missing Links series and a lot of the Private Parts and Pieces series and the Slow Dance album. Some really, really great stuff there. Brilliant, brilliant musician. If you think of some of the best Mark Isham soundtracks, that's kind of in the same area that I think of when I think of Anthony Phillips' work. And he's still continuing on. He's not slowing down. He's not stopping. So he's got many more releases than the one I've shown. I just wish I had them all. Okay, guys, I'm on a roll here. Might be my longest video ever, but thanks for watching, and I will see you all very soon.